Remember when Pokemon games looked like this? Now all we have is games that look like this. I know, how dare they? The horror. In a way, every Pokemon game ever made has had a negative impact on the perspective of the series. We've all seen and likely even taken part in that cycle. There hasn't been a single new release post Pokemon becoming the cultural phenomenon it's known as today that wasn't met with huge amounts of disappointment, to put it lightly, or contempt, to put it honestly. On some level, this is fair, as someone that has largely built my reputation on these here YouTubes on my Pokemon opinions, many of which are critical of the limitations of the games in one way or another. I think it's totally reasonable to want more out of this media juggernaut that so many love so much. However, since day one, the wants of the many are not one and the same, nor are they equally represented in the discourse, but one particular want that permeates my timelines and algorithms is that these games and these games and finally this game should have resulted in a different status quo for modern day Pokemon titles. I think this is dumb, to put it bluntly, or damaging, to put it in a more accurate but somehow more vague intro to a larger conversation sort of way. Let's talk about it. But first, there's a ton of new Pokemon content on the way from me that you should subscribe to see, some positive, some negative, some like this, somewhere in between. So if you like what you see here and want more of it, assuming you haven't already, do me a favor and subscribe. It's a well-known fact that the majority of people that watch videos aren't subscribed to the channels they watch them from, and YouTube isn't the best at surfacing these videos, so if you want the best chance of seeing our videos, make sure to click subscribe and the notification bell. Okay, on to the video. Oh, and fair warning, this may get ranty. The start of this conflict has its roots planted firmly in the initial peak of the Pokemon cultural boom in the late 90s. I'm not going to belabor the details, but despite all odds, a couple of deeply technologically flawed games made for screens with less pixels than the screen you're watching this video on likely has per inch captured the imaginations of millions. Game Freak was aware of this, and they knew there was a market for taking these games onto bigger, more detail-oriented screens for people to enjoy. The result of this was ultimately a duo, or trio if in Japan, of games in the Pokemon Stadium subseries. The entire purpose was to bring Pokemon and the battles they partake in to life in a way never before seen, on a home console on the biggest screen in the house with up to 3 other friends at a time. And not just that, it also added to the package by way of some pretty iconic Mario Party-esque minigames that you can play with friends as well. This series, to my knowledge, is the most successful attempt at this core mission statement, but it's not the only attempt, and given the zeitgeist around this topic, largely due to it being limited in its aim to being largely spectacle alone, it's not even the fan favorite despite its unmatched commercial success as a pure battle simulator, as it were. Pokémon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness hold this title as far as I can gather, and for a few reasons. On one end, and the most relevant to the topic of the video, is due to the detailed animation seen in the game. For the life of me, I don't understand how people seem not to care with these games that many of the animations and models come from the Stadium series of games, but that's neither here nor there. The point still remains that people do like them. The second thing is the game's story and tone being perceived as being darker and therefore more adult. This, for me, is where the disconnect starts to widen between myself and this segment of the community. I don't like these games at all. Full disclosure, I get the appeal of this subseries is largely meant to be that it is a lot closer to traditional JRPGs, and if you didn't know, I dislike those as well. Obviously, the genre of Pokemon games is pretty much always JRPG, so it's not like this move doesn't make sense on paper. But once you put an ounce of thought into it, you should realize that these games are intentionally antithetical to a key philosophy of Pokemon, and that's the sheer variety of Pokemon available to bring with you on your journey. The whole point is supposed to be picking your favorites and pitting them up against friends with their favorites. Game Freak didn't intend for every player to have the same team. To be fair, while they do it much better than Genius Sonority in these games, Game Freak doesn't do that good of a job of this in mainline games as it is, but that's a separate issue and video entirely. The GameCube duology severely limits this, as both games combined, even if you generously and foolishly assume no crossover, have less Pokemon than the original Pokemon games did. Of course the animations are more detailed. There's a fraction of the amount of necessary animations. That's somehow even simpler math than the mainline Pokemon games themselves. Cue Pokémon Battle Revolution. Now this is an example of a game that the community evangelizes that I can actually somewhat get behind. It retains a respectable number of usable Pokemon. Pokemon have even more involved attack animations, reactions to those attacks on the receiving end, the camera work is unmatched, and we even got a taste of semi-customizable player characters. This game is as close as you can get to arguing that Pokemon games can and have been more visually ambitious in the past. That said, even these completely ignore the existence of a story, training, trading, or any of the other stuff that millions of people expect to be able to spend hundreds of hours doing in every Pokemon release. I do think there's merit to having a battle simulator that doesn't require any of this stuff to get started. Pokemon Showdown has been a shining example of that for years. Even with that in mind though, it's a bad benchmark for a mainline game that's expected to include so much more and is thereby inherently afforded less time and resources to invest in, making it comparable to the effort seen in a game that only has to focus on making the battles look good. Now we have the other examples of Pokemon games that people seem to find disproportionate value in, and those games, in no particular order with a brief synopsis as to why they're beloved, are Pokemon Let's Go, which against all odds is now somehow praised for its visuals and different approach to the formula despite the initial backlash. Pokémon Tournament, a game that has very little in common with the mainline Pokemon games, but again has franchise-leading visuals and production value. New Pokemon Snap, which is a similar affair to Pokken despite how different even they are to each other, they both do offer a higher fidelity take on the Pokemon world than we've gotten for the big ticket game releases on Switch, and they're also both coincidentally developed by teams over at Bandai Namco. And finally, Pokemon Legends Arceus, a game that people fawn over for its experimental take on the monotony of Pokemon gameplay and the experience of filling the Pokedex. Yet again, an entire game completely dedicated to fleshing out one specific aspect of mainline Pokemon games while severely scaling back most of the other elements of Pokemon games that provide them with their battle-tested gameplay loop. Of course, I appreciate many of these games for what they brought to the table that already have and could potentially continue to impact the future of Pokemon games, but that's just it. They're good for what foundation they can lay. They're definitely not good for being potential replacements or even simultaneous mainstays for the Pokemon franchise. These games all have a few things in common. One, they are lauded as releases that take care to push the series forward in some way the mainline games seem to ignore. Two, they all have a much smaller scope than the mainline games in terms of content and mass appeal. And three, they are all mostly not developed by Game Freak. These details in concert are generally overlooked, which I think is insane given the fact that even one of these factors would completely neuter mainline Pokemon games' ability to be created with the same level of superficial scrutiny. Game development, no matter where you look, both is and isn't a few things people seem to be ignorant to despite their insistence on belaboring the ironic argument that it comes down to incompetence in development alone. The most important thing that is paid no attention is no matter the monetary value of a studio or property, their experience is unique to them and generally their priorities are unique to them. As gaming fans, the immediate thought process when hearing the worth of Pokemon as a brand is how, when it seems the games don't have a relative amount of resources invested in them. I've gone down this rabbit hole in a video you can watch in the card above. While the conclusion doesn't matter for the point of this video, the TLDR is the games aren't, or at least haven't been, as integral to that success as gamers seem to think. Short of symbolism if you want to get pretentious about it. They are definitely profitable. Game Freak definitely genuinely isn't a small developer that is in need of pity or charity or anything like that. But culture does play a part here. They don't have the same scale everything always attitude that Western studios have. This means that their games tend to have very specific goals. Every game, main series games included, and arguably especially, have to pick priorities and stick to them. If you look at the smaller spin-off games that the community rallies behind, their goals are clearly simple and thereby easier to accomplish. Making a 20-ish hour linear traditional RPG with less than 100 Pokemon is way easier than making a game that's just as, if not a little longer, with more than 4 times that amount of Pokemon, with the added requirement of including a pretty robust and surprisingly competent online suite of features, and the need to facilitate an entire competitive scene that balloons the replayability of main series games exponentially. The expectation that every game is everything to everyone is something that uniquely places Pokemon in a position that few games are in, especially when you consider the fact that the general expectation is to improve everything that's there while adding hundreds of new variables every time. Like Call of Duty comes out every year, yes, but it's not bringing 100 or more completely unique character designs that are then needed to be factored into the balancing for hundreds of other completely unique characters. Or on the other hand, for the XD comparison, or even Battle Revolution, of course they have more involved animations. That's most of the work they have to do at all. They didn't have to create dozens of new Pokemon designs that are intended to be icons for a new generation of children around the world. They didn't have to add to and rebalance a competitive landscape for a prominent esport, and they didn't have to do all of that while still adding to the quantity of what was already there that needs all of this care regardless. They just copied a fraction of that homework and made it look prettier. Now I get that for many, visuals are a key priority, visual medium and all of that, but clearly for many more, as indicated by modern day Pokemon games leapfrogging the sales of their immediate predecessors, despite this very public outcry, it's not that important here. This isn't the same as not mattering at all. Like the cause of this problem, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Of course I want Pokemon games to look and run better. I've talked about more than most people I know and have been doing just that for the better part of 10 years while everyone else was happily consuming the 3DS era of Pokemon despite their technical shortcomings. Or even before then, like I alluded to in the beginning of the video, Pokemon games have been this way always. No one, including these people, made this thing until now. So how are the creators and publishers of these games supposed to realistically meet this expectation after decades of fan and critical acclaim for games that were just as, if not more technically flawed at like an eighth the resolution or lower? I know that a lot of this comes from the false equivalence that many fans have done things like upscale the games that I think are poisoning the well to look even more relatively impressive than what we have and are therefore being used in. If this random guy can do it, why can't, more accurately won't, the multi-billion-dollar brand comparisons? Without acknowledging the obvious straw man is a straw man. Of course, it's largely because people have come to the conclusion, and this much is fair, empathizing with a faceless corporation is weird. But people do work at this corporation that are putting hard work into moving Pokemon forward that this sentiment ignores. Many of these people are, or were, the same people that made the games that people are pointing to as the superior product. However, even that doesn't discount that even these bad faith arguments have some merit. Even as someone that doesn't agree with the tone or mythology behind a lot of these fan crusades, I do appreciate that they in some way communicate that Pokemon games can and should grow. The part that needs to be ironed out here is how do they do that without jeopardizing Pokemon's proven process or status? No matter the level of love for the franchise we all may have, one thing that none of us are is the leader of a multi-billion-dollar empire, so it's definitely worth noting that some consideration should be made to their interest in maintaining that status quo. I think, however, it is also worth noting that despite their actual increasing success, they are very clearly making quantifiable strides towards evolving the franchise from as many angles as possible per release. So with that said, what can or should they do to make the future of Pokemon one that fans and corporations alike can be proud of? Funnily enough, I do actually think smaller games like Pokemon Stadium, XD, or even Snap should play a part in growing the mainline games to meet their full potential. But I think think it's more in a Rockstar Tennis' foundation making its way into Grand Theft Auto sort of way than I think it's Pokemon Company somehow absorbing new Pokemon Snaps, a game that's a fraction of the size, visual fidelity through osmosis sort of way the community seems to think is the obvious path forward. I think it's important to acknowledge and accept the fact that this studio is not only not a part of the initial HD era, but even removed from that, Game Freak was late to the party relative to Nintendo, who was a generation removed from the rest of the industry. It's to be expected that they're not going to be hitting it out of the park, even with normal expectations of bringing HD Pokemon to the masses, but on top of that, they're attempting to bring unprecedented concepts to the series in the process. No matter the revisionist history, I know that there were bumps along the road for even the most revered studios. They were just the norm because everyone being referred to here in this comparison made their transitions in tandem with each other, so they were allowed to experience the process of trial and error without the level of scrutiny that Game Freak is facing now for doing the same. I think the best case scenario for everyone is for Game Freak to continue to work towards a consistently higher quality product because it is priced like products with higher standards, but also for consumers to be realistic about their arguments. I personally am off-put by the hyperbole every time I see people say Gen 9 is the buggiest Pokemon has ever been, when Gen 1 and 2 exist and every generation since haven't fared much better. My source being myself, someone that never took these long-ass hiatuses I'm seeing from the perspective pundits on the internet. I don't say that to question their fandom, but I do question the relevance of their points when their only backing is games they played nearly 30 years ago when they were 8, juxtaposed with the Western games they're accustomed to playing now on their $1,500 gaming PCs, or console aimed at emulating that experience, as well as literally emulated souped-up massage versions of Pokemon games from the past like the inspiration for this video. Of course, this isn't an uncommon thing in the Nintendo community at large. People have this unrealistic view of fan projects across the board, but in this instance, people are particularly guilty of fawning over RPG Maker ROM hacks with little more than the promise of edgy fanfiction disguised as a more adult take on the magic animal world where we tell an electric mouse to punch the other electric mouse in the face. Or more specifically in this case, they go in and pretty up existing models in their bottomless amounts of free time and pretend that's somehow more impressive than the original creators making something from nothing under strict deadlines, budget restrictions, and hardware limitations. These comparisons end up being even more damaging than the spin-offs because they benefit from the lampshading that is the expectations for the sheer percentage of segments with the Pokemon fandom being catered to, but they also get the benefit of people's natural inclination to side with people over corporations, so they get to gain clout off of making inferior products, piggybacking off of the franchise they are criticizing. I'm well aware this isn't actively the fault of the spin-off games I'm calling out in this video, but the fact remains that gamer brain is too one-dimensional to be able to parse through the complexities that come with their existence, so the impact ends up being that the spin-off games are propped up as these impeccable examples of what Pokemon should be, when in reality they are infinitely smaller in scale. I get that millions of people's experience with Pokemon games is to play through the one time, catching only their favorite Pokemon, and if they battle any humans at all, it's limited to their friends using the same team they played through the game with. The problem with placating to this experience is it isn't actually the one that matters. They experience a fraction of the game. They don't contribute to the long-term strategy of a generation. Narrowing the scope of the overall experience of the game to improve the superficial aspects of this small burst playstyle would ultimately dramatically decrease the long-term engagement the current active player base puts into every single Pokemon game, and that would neuter, if not entirely destroy, their current multi-tiered esports strategy, which, while these players may not care or even know to care, it doesn't change the fact that the developers do and millions of players do, to the tune of investing hundreds to thousands of hours and in many cases dollars competing in the game. But the proposed solution of scaling what's worked back in favor of achieving this goal would at best threaten to take away most, if not an entire experience, away from the people that choose to opt in. All of this to say, comparison is the thief of joy, especially when you consider the level of comparisons being made here, and this goes triple for the ones that only consider the very narrow superficial wants for the franchise from more casual fans. Of course they are worth considering. Pokemon Company should make efforts to improve their experience, but not at the expense of the people that inject money into the brand with more than an occasional 60 to maybe $100 purchase a year. I believe in criticizing the things you love in hopes of it becoming and/or remaining its best. But these half-baked hyperbolic arguments formulated by people whose worst insult imaginable is games looking like they came from the era they simultaneously pine for is ridiculous. The corporations involved should make mainline Pokemon games better, for sure, but also fans should make their complaints regarding this issue make sense along the way. Also, I mean, it's worth noting that fans can cry for sweeping change for decades, and when they get what they've been asking for, they act like they've been robbed of their childhood. And that's my TED Talk. Not actually. Don't sue me, TED Talk people. Subscribe to the channel, check out the Patreon if you like this video and would like to be a part in supporting the creation of more like it. Maybe get some cool merch in exchange. Okay, goodbye.